Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Russell Gmirkin. He's done extensive work on the Old Testament, and he's written a few books comparing the Old Testament to Hellenistic text and making a case that the Old Testament is familiar with Plato, Manetho, Berosus, and other late first millennium BC text. And the books that he has written covering that topic is called Plato's Timaeus and the Biblical Creation Accounts, Berosus and Genesis, Manetho and Exodus. And he also wrote Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, which will be today's topic that we're going to be focusing on. Well, welcome to the program, Russell.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So my first question for you is, what is the first thing that you can remember that you would say is the trigger that got you on the path of comparing Plato and suggesting that Plato's works were utilized in the creation of the Hebrew Bible?
Well, I saw some parallels when I was researching Berosus and Genesis,
Mm-hmm.
but it seemed like such a large topic that I just put it to one side. Then a gentleman named Philippe Wadenboom wrote a book called Argonauts of the Desert, which it's an odd title, but it has systematically cataloged comparisons with Greek literature and the books Genesis through Kings. And it had a fairly extensive section on Plato, Plato's laws. He pointed out that Eusebius had already listed numerous parallels between uh, the Mosaic Law Code and Plato. But of course, Eusebius, like everyone else in antiquity, assumed that Moses was, 1,000 years older than Plato, and so
Mm-hmm.
Plato must have borrowed from Moses. Um, but Philippe, and I agreed with him, said that the reverse was probably the case. So that was really the stimulus for my own research.
What do you think are the most interesting, most powerful parallels between Plato's works and the Torah that you can think of?
Well, one of the striking features is that Plato advocated a system of 12 tribes for the ideal nation. You don't have a 12 tribe system um, anywhere in the ancient Near East, but it's all over the Greek world because they would rotate duties from one tribe to the next throughout the year. So there were a number of Greek city states that were organized with either 6 or 12 tribes. That's one. Another really major one is that Plato advocated a theocratic form of government. And in support of this rule by the gods, um, he, he said that a nation should take their law codes and convince the citizenry that they were ancient and divine and had never been changed since the dawn of time, which is what we see in the Torah. But Plato also said that you should create a whole national literature in support of that whole divine government so that everyone in the country would only have that approved holy set of texts for that's all they could read. That their whole educational system was based on it, and therefore they would all adopt that worldview. So basically, Plato invented the idea of a Bible, a national literature, and that is one of the most striking things. You don't see that anywhere in the ancient Near East. You don't see that anywhere in the Greek world. It's only in Plato. And hence the title of my book, Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible.
What do you think about people that try to say that they try to defend the Torah predating Plato, and they say, well, don't we have some fragments of the little itty bitty fragments of the Torah with some verses, maybe from Numbers, maybe a couple of scraps of Exodus somewhere hundreds of years earlier, and even some will even go as far as saying, well, what about the discovery that Dr. Scott Stripling made at Mount Ebal about the curses of Yahweh? That's that dates to the late second millennium BCE. So what do you think of all of that?
Well, there are what they call the silver amulets from Ketef Hinnom that Gabriel Barquet discovered. And they're from about 600 BC, and they contain very strong parallel to the priestly blessing in the Book of Numbers. But as Barquet himself said, the amulet, the formula there is clearly an oral formula, and it doesn't point to the existence of a written text at that time. I met Barquet in Jerusalem, by the way, a great guy. But so there's one example where you do have an older parallel, but not in written form. You also have in the Elephantine papyri, you have references to the spring festival of, the days of unleavened bread, but not from a written text. And in the so-called Passover letter from Elephantine, it describes how to observe the Passover. That week is on the proper date. The customs are basically the same, but there's no Moses and no Exodus, none of the material that you find in the Bible. So you have a lot of echoes. I mean, religion is very conservative. You can have religious traditions that are preserved over 1,000 years time or more in oral form, but not necessarily written form. So you have to distinguish between what we have in writing and the ancient traditions. Sure, there are lots of ancient traditions predating the Torah, but they weren't written down. At least there's no evidence of that.
So what you're saying is it was largely oral, and then it only started getting written down way later in the game.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the Psalms, which don't reference the Exodus or Moses or any of those what I would call late traditions, they may have predated the Torah. They might be quite old. So religion tends to be very conservative, and you see a lot preserved there.
If I remember correctly, you say that the Septuagint and the Hebrew version of it, or the Hebrew Bible, they were composed simultaneously in the 3rd century BCE. Do you think that the two texts were identical, or could they have been originally vastly different from one another and only became more identical later?
I think that when we're talking about the Septuagint, we're talking specifically about the first 5 books,
right?
The Pentateuch, and according to the Septuagint studies is a big field, and there's been a lot of detailed studies, and all the studies have shown that the Septuagint is a very wooden, literal translation. So whatever they were copying exactly. Like a lot of the puns in Hebrew, they don't really come across. So no. So I think that the two texts were basically identical. They didn't converge later. Interestingly, my latest book on Plato's Timaeus shows that so Plato's Timaeus has long been accepted as a source for the Septuagint translation of Genesis 1 because some of the Greek phrasing really comes from Timaeus, which was Plato's creation account. But my book shows that Timaeus also was strongly influenced throughout Genesis 1 through 3. So it really shows that there's an identity between the underlying Hebrew and the Greek, and also Plato, that they all tell the same story.
I know that you also point out additional parallels between Plato and the Book of Genesis, and the more detailed parallels with the creation accounts. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, my latest book, which has just come out on May 3rd, it breaks a lot of new ground. Traditionally, the Genesis 1 has been considered a priestly creation account. Genesis 2 through 3 has been considered an earlier Yahwistic creation account. Two different stories created at two different times. So my latest book is going to show, though, that the two were contemporary and they both drew directly on Plato's Timaeus. Timaeus had basically two creation stories. In the start of Timaeus, this astronomer and philosopher named Timaeus is telling Socrates about his theories on how the world was created. He said there was a craftsman who created, a perfect world out of a pre-existing chaos, and he fashioned the sun in the sky, and this. Anyway, there's very extensive parallels between that creation account by the perfect divine monotheistic creator at the dawn of the universe, and Genesis 1 and Timaeus. But then Plato goes on to narrate basically a second creation story, because this cosmic monotheistic creator, everything he created was eternal and perfect and good, just wonderful, just by nature, because he couldn't create anything different because he was so wonderful. So there was a problem. Humans are not immortal. They are capable of wickedness. And so Plato couldn't have his divine creator creating humans. So this demiurge, this craftsman or creator, he delegated that to his sons and daughters. He said they were going to have the task of creating mortal life, because if they did it instead of him, then then these creatures could die, they could make mistakes. So he had basically his creation story was in two parts: the perfect creation of the cosmos, which very closely corresponds to Genesis 1, and then the creation of mortal life on Earth, which very closely corresponds to Genesis 2 and so on and so forth, and the sons of God in Genesis. So the God of Genesis 2 is not the creator God of Genesis 1. He's a dinky mortal God. He lives down in Eden. He's not omniscient. He doesn't, he has to ask Adam, what's going on here? How come you guys are hiding? He asked Canaan, where's Abel? He's not omniscient. He's not all powerful. He's located on the earth, much like the other sons of God in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. So you have, and this is very radical. This is very new cutting edge research that I'm doing. So you have a cosmic creator in Genesis 1, and then you have these sons of God in the rest of Genesis that are of a totally different order. And Yahweh was not the cosmic God of creation. He's a dinky national god, the patron god of the Jews and Israelites, but he was not initially conceived of as all-powerful, all-knowing, cosmic, so on and so forth. So it breaks a lot of ground, and and I hope that it's widely read.
What
No
do you
one
think?
has
Hmm.
put that obvious thesis forward before.
What do you think about Baruch Halpern when he suggested that First Samuel and the Dead Sea Scrolls is closer to the Septuagint than the Hebrew Bible? Would you say that would be additional evidence kind of reinforcing that uh, the dating, the late dating for the Torah?
Well, yeah, I mean Samuel. That's a later book in the Greek Old Testament, so it doesn't really support the date or circumstances of the creation of the Pentateuch. But I think Davila, in his series on the discoveries in the Judean desert, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls, he pointed out that there's a small fragment from Genesis 1 that they discovered that is closer to the Septuagint than it is to the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible. So this was strong evidence that there was a version of these biblical books and the Pentateuch in specific that was circulating that the Septuagint translated that was different and earlier than the Masoretic text that we're all used to. And that's kind of standard a standard result or conclusion now in Septuagint studies that there's the Masoretic text, of the King James version or whatever, and then there was some other version circulating that was a little bit older that they made the Septuagint translation from.
Would you connect Pandora opening the Pandora's box and releasing evil upon the earth? Would you connect that with Eve and the serpent and the book of Genesis? Or is there
Yeah,
other Hellenistic parallels you had in mind with the fall of man?
yeah. There's a number of parallels. Certainly, Pandora was one of the parallels that was used.
Hmm.
Um, Plato talked about the knowledge of good and evil in several of his dialogues, and he talked about how people can possess the knowledge of good and evil, and yet their passions, their appetites, their sexual drive, or wanting, seeing something beautiful, that can overcome their awareness of the difference between good and evil, and so that you can do a person with all the knowledge in the world can do a bad thing. So that is a strong theme in that story. Um, another another Platonic element is in the book of Timaeus. Um, Sex was compared to he used the metaphor of eating the fruit of the tree
Hmm.
because the woman hungered for the produce of the man. So he uses that specific metaphor. Um, but certainly the Pandora story, that's one element. And but there are several different strands that enter into it.
In the book of Isaiah, when it talks about the fall of the morning star, um, uh, would you connect that to Theophon being uh, uh, because
Yeah,
he
he got
Theophon,
too close to the sun.
yeah.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, just not too long ago, they discovered a fragment, I think of Callisthenes, who's a Greek poet, that talks about um, the myth of faith on who he had these wings of wax. He flew up too high to the sky and they melted, and he plunged to the earth. That's the Greek myth. But the language in this new fragment that they've discovered is very, very close to Isaiah, and scholars have remarked on it. They're very puzzled by it, but I think it's a strong possibility that that passage in Isaiah was using, I think it's Callisthenes, um, anyway, 3rd century Greek poet. There does seem to be a strong connection there.
I know that you compare the book of Exodus to Manetho, and what's interesting about Manetho is that for anyone that wants to read Manetho, at least what we have of him, Manetho doesn't appear to ever mention the Torah. When Josephus cites Manetho, he never makes mention of Manetho mentioning the Torah. And when they were writing the book of Exodus, which you say utilized Manetho, was Manetho? Do you think they viewed Manetho as like, okay, we're going to use this guy as a proto draft for the book of Exodus? Do you think they looked at it that way or from a different angle?
Well, I think the Exodus story drew on 2 sources.
Okay.
A little bit earlier than Manetho was a Greek writer named Hecataeus of Abdera.
Okay.
And he visited Alexandria during the reign of the first king, Ptolemy the First Soter, or Lagus. And he wrote a book called the Egyptica, or the History of Egypt, that explained about this new Egyptian realm that the Ptolemies were going to rule, their history, their customs, all sorts of stuff. And included in that was a foundation story that contains the first mention in any language of a figure called Moses. And in this typical Greek foundation story, he says that Moses was an Egyptian nobleman, and that since Egypt was overpopulated, they led an expedition to what's now the land of Judea, which was entirely unpopulated at the time, and that this Moses established Jerusalem as its capital, built its temple, created its constitution and laws, and things like that. So it's a typical Greek colony or foundation story, and it has Judea being founded from Egypt under the leadership of a fellow named Moses. But other than that, all the other details are widely divergent from the biblical account. It does draw on Plato's laws, interestingly, and has Moses found a nation with 12 tribes, like Plato advocated. But so anyway, you have this Hecataeus of Abdera. He basically gives the outline of the Exodus story. So the biblical authors use that. But Manetho, he wrote about 285 BC, 3 or 4 decades later. We know that he knew Hecataeus of Abdera. So in Josephus, Manetho has these 2 stories about how wicked Asiatics were expelled from Egypt into the land of Judea. First, there were the Hyksos, the shepherd kings, who were terrible. They overthrew the Egyptian gods and religions, and finally they were overthrown, and they went to Judea and founded Jerusalem and its temple. And then later on, they came back. They were invited back by Osarseph, who was a priest of Seth Typhon, the Asiatic god of chaos and destruction. And it was the same history repeating itself. Eventually, they were repelled or expelled back into Judea. So it's like a second Exodus account. Both of them have a lot of parallels to the biblical account. And the biblical account seems to be aware of those two stories in Manetho. And the thing is, Manetho says that in that second story, that Osiris, the wicked Egyptian priest who led these lepers and Hyksos into Judea, that some people said that he was the same as that Jewish figure called Moses. That wasn't part of Manetho's original story, but some people in that time were saying that Moses was that bad guy. So the Exodus takes Manetho into account, but is responding to those negative slanders in Manetho. Exodus says, the Israelites, the shepherds from Goshen, they didn't oppress the Egyptians like Manetho said. They were oppressed by the Egyptians, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of defensive. They flip a lot of Manetho to come out with their own story that's more positive towards Moses and the original people from Egypt who colonized Judea. So it really copies Hecataeus of Dea, but it also defends itself against Manetho. But it comes after both of them, in my opinion.
What do you think of Josephus's claim in Against Apion that when he read Manetho, he interpreted the history as if the Hyksos and the Jewish people are the same people? He said that the Hyksos were the forefathers of the Jewish people.
Yeah, it's understandable that he would say so. They were shepherd kings, and the biblical account says that the children of Israel living in the land of Goshen, they were placed there because they were shepherds. They had sheep, and the Egyptians didn't like sheep. The Exodus story borrowed several elements from Manetho. So Josephus, reading both of them side by side, would say, there's a lot of connections between one and the other. So that's understandable that he would create a link. But, and some people say that the biblical Exodus account is it's a historical memory of the Hyksos. But you have a lot of advocates for that. But I would say that really the biblical Exodus story is a reaction to Manetho's literary account. It doesn't really contain any historical memories at all, but it's responding to early literature. I mean, the people of Israel and Judea, they were autochthonous. They were earthborn. They lived there forever. They didn't come from Egypt. They didn't come from Babylonia. They were basically the local Canaanites who developed into the Jews and the Sumerians or Israelites. There was no exodus from anywhere, but they created these exodus stories in response to Manetho and other things that they read at a late date.
Do you think that Hecataeus's version of Moses, given that in this scenario he would be the earliest source ever mentioning somebody called Moses, do you think his version of it is historical or could be historical?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, he had a whole section in his Egyptiaca, his history of Egypt, that dealt with all sorts of stories of the Egyptians. According to him, they colonized the whole world. They
Hmm.
colonized Greece. Sesostris went up to the Black Sea and colonized the kingdom of Colchis. Um, he told one story that was preserved of how um, Belus, Belus,
Hmm.
he led a colonizing expedition from Egypt to Babylonia, and he founded their priesthood and their laws and all of their customs. Well, we know who Belus is. That's Bel Marduk.
Hmm.
That's the god Marduk, and that's not based on history. That's just another one of these exaggerated Egyptian claims. Um, for the case of Judea, there was the Egyptians really had a better case for them than a lot of their claims to have invented culture throughout the whole world, because both the Egyptians and the Judeans and Phoenicians along the coast, they all practiced circumcision. So in Hecataeus, you read the claims that they learned circumcision from the Egyptians. So, at least there was a little bit of evidence to support that foundation myth.
What do you think the point was for Hecataeus to write this fictional history? What do you think his agenda was?
Well, he was repeating a lot of stories of the Egyptian priests. The
Hmm.
priests, they drew connections between Egypt and all sorts of places around the world. They said that their gods were basically the same gods as the Greeks, but by different names,
Yeah.
which I can understand why they would make that claim, because there was a Greek trading colony at Nitocris on the Egyptian Delta,
Hmm.
couple of Greek trading colonies, and they lived there, and they kind of merged their gods with the Egyptian gods. You see that in Herodotus and a lot of places. So, because of this religious syncretism, the Egyptians said our civilization is connected to all these other places around the world. And you also have to understand at that time, Egypt had fallen. It had been conquered by Darius the Persian and Cambyses, and then Alexander the Great. And they were under Greek rule. And so the Egyptians, like the Babylonians and different peoples, they created this glorious vision of how wonderful their civilization was in the past, greater than their Greek conquerors.
Hmm.
You get that in the history of Babylon by Berosus, the Indica by Megasthenes, the history of Egypt. Um, and the Jewish literature too. They claim to have invented a lot of things. They were a conquered people, but there's been books that have shown that in the early Hellenistic era, all these conquered nations resurrected their past in great and glorious detail to kind of get a little bit of national pride out of being subjected, ruled, conquered peoples. And so they wanted to point out all their grand accomplishments of the past. And that's part of the motivation for these stories about how Egypt colonized the whole world.
Hmm. Going back to what we were talking about, what you were talking about earlier about the Septuagint Book of Genesis, in Genesis, I think it was Genesis 1, you were saying, is copying in some cases the exact phraseology in Plato. Does a lot of that happen? Is there a lot of places in the Torah where it does that, where it copies the sentences either nearly verbatim or verbatim?
Um, it's really it's most prominent in Genesis 1, and
Okay.
then to a lesser extent in Genesis 2 and 3. But I think in Genesis 1, and I argue this in my new book, that in this one instance at least, these very educated Judean and Samaritan scholars who had studied Plato, who created their own uh, story about the origins of the universe based on Plato, um, and they were philosophically very well read, highly educated. In this one case, in Genesis 1 at least, it appears that the actual authors were translators as well,
Hmm.
because some of the phrasing in Genesis 1, especially in Genesis 1, verse 2, where the world was without form and void, in the Septuagint, the the Greek for that really comes comes right out of Timaeus. It comes out of Plato's writings, and all Septuagint scholars accept that it was influenced by Timaeus. So in this case, you have the authors who had read Timaeus and who had written their account in Hebrew uh, based on Timaeus. They also were directly involved in the translation and used some of those phrases that they had originally read in Greek and kind of translated into Hebrew for the books of Genesis. They kind of reverted back to the original language of Timaeus in their translation. So I see the authors most directly involved in the translation at the start of Genesis, especially. Um, not so much throughout the rest of the Pentateuch.
So so when Plato talks about the divine craftsman, the book of Genesis, when it talks about that man being created from clay, it kind of reminds me of Prometheus
Yeah,
when he creates man from clay. But in the Mesopotamian creation myths, they also have that going too. They have their own versions of man being created by clay. So what I wanted to ask you is, do you think that the Prometheus myth or the Mesopotamian version of those myths influenced the book of Genesis more, or is the book of Genesis um, compiling them together?
yeah. It draws on a lot of um, Mesopotamian as well as Greek sources. I think
Mm,
Prometheus is a lot more prominent in you know in Genesis 2, as you say, creating
mm,
man out of clay. But Timaeus says that he also says that man was fashioned out of earth and fire and water, um, and that when he died, he would go back to those elements, which you also see in Genesis. From the ground you were created, and you will go back to it when you die. That's a bit of Plato there, but yes, I think that definitely was informed by the Prometheus myth. Um, there seems to be some Prometheus 2 where at the end of Genesis 3 and humans are expelled from the garden, and God seems to be providing them with some elementary technology. They're going to have to go and till the soil. He teaches them how to make clothing out of skins. And Prometheus taught humankind all the arts necessary for their survival, since they were naked and subject to cold and heat, and so there's Prometheus at the end of Genesis 3 as well, and also Prometheus is part of the Pandora story. So the authors definitely knew Hesiod and the Prometheus tale.
mm,
But there's also a lot of Mesopotamian material, especially in Genesis 4 through 9, with 10 long-lived generations before the flood, and the flood story itself, which comes from the Gilgamesh epic. So yeah, it's very eclectic. I can identify almost a dozen different sources that were used.
Hmm. I remember that you were saying something about Ptolemy. I think it was Ptolemy the Second Philadelphus, that they wanted to hide that they were talking about him in a certain critical way, so they had to misspell something involving the Greek or Hebrew equivalent of the word rabbit.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that to the audience?
Oh, sure. That's one of the arguments for the date of the Septuagint.
Okay.
The first Ptolemy, he was called Ptolemy Lagus. He was a legate. He was the descendant from, I guess, some guy named Lagus, which means rabbit in. And then after he saved the island of Rhodes, his name kind of changed to Ptolemy I Soter, which means the savior. But some people still refer to him as a legate, as a rabbit. While the rabbits in Greek tradition, well, I guess in most traditions, they're pretty promiscuous. They're very famous for their sexual exploits, I guess. Anyway, they were used. That was their reputation in Greek literature, and some people kind of who were critics of Ptolemy I Soter and Ptolemy II, they would bring up this whole rabbit thing. Especially since Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, he married his sister according to Egyptian custom, and so critics and people devising witty epigrams, they would bring up this whole rabbit thing. Well, when the Septuagint translation was made, they avoided that translation of the word rabbit as Lagus because it would be insulting to the Ptolemaic kings, and and that helps date when the Septuagint was created in under Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. I talked about it a bit in my book on Berosus and Genesis, but other scholars have also cited that as an argument for the date of the Septuagint.
And that would fit in with the records, like the letter of Aristeas, the Talmud, and Josephus, saying that it was Ptolemy II that commissioned the Septuagint, not Ptolemy I.
Yeah. Yes. Which Aristobulus, the author of Pseudo-Aristeas, the letter of Aristeas, he could have gotten that from the library catalog at the Great Library of Alexandria, or the manuscript tag of the Septuagint. They invented library science in Alexandria under Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, a gentleman named Callimachus. He invented basically the card catalog. And those entries listed the author, the date, where a book was written, how many lines the book had. So that would have listed Ptolemy II as, that it was created during that time. And then Aristobulus, who wrote around 150 BC, he could have drawn on that in order to create a temporal setting for his story. Because the manuscript says it was written under Ptolemy II, evidently.
B Bear, thank you for the $5 Australian. He has a question for you, Russell. His
Yeah.
question is, what do you think of Plato's noble lie in the Republic? That it is sometimes beneficial to tell people that the sky is father and earth is mother.
Well, the sky is father and earth is mother. Yeah. Now, Plato doesn't refer to that story in particular, but the noble lie is very interesting.
Hmm.
Plato says that rulers get to lie to the people. They get to be liars. Um, the noble lie, as he described it, he said, um, sometimes it's permitted for the ruling class to make up stories about the distant past. They take place before we have any records, so you can't tell if it's true or false. You can't
Hmm.
verify it one way or the other. And it's very much like Greek tragedy, where it would set these stories, Aeschylus and Euripides and whatever. They put on these plays that were set in the distant past, feature gods and rulers from legend, and they make up a bunch of stuff, and it was acceptable. It was noble. It was entertainment. Anyway, Plato said, uh, if you tell a story that's set in the distant past, and if it portrays the gods in a positive light, um, then such a story, even though it's technically a lie, can serve noble purposes. It can convey ethical truths more effectively than the truth. So he said, rulers, not regular people. If regular people lie, they get executed. But the
Hmm.
rulers, they get a pass. They can create stories about the past that serve the national interests. Um, in Republic, he particularly talked about the myth of the four metals. He said that when Athens was founded, the gods Athena and Hephaestus, they created the first Athenians out of the ground, like Prometheus, uh, right out of the ground. Uh, and he said that they were created in four different races or people. One of them had a golden soul. They
Hmm.
were the ruling class. They were the guardians. Another had a silver. They had the metal, physical metal silver built into their soul. And they were the warrior class. And then the brass and iron, they were like the farmers and craftsmen. So in this noble lie, he said that, Athenians should be made to believe this story that he's just making up right there on the spot,
Hmm.
um, so that they will accept that their rulers are a different breed with this divine golden soul, that they're destined to be caretakers for the rest of us. And then he repeated the noble lie in Timaeus and
Hmm.
Critias, where he said that the ancient Athenians, they from the very start, the gods founded their nation with a ruling class and this and that. So it's a foundation myth that he said the rulers could legitimately and ought to create to promote um, a citizenry that's obedient and pliant and will accept their rulers and it's good for the country if everybody, if the people are sheep. I mean, he literally uses the sheep
Hmm.
metaphor over and over again. So yeah, Plato was big on the noble lie, um, and really the foundation story in the Bible is an example of the noble lie or noble fiction, we can call it. This great story set in the past where you can't really verify it, but it served ethical and theological purposes. Very Platonic.
When looking at the Masoretic text, the Masoretic version of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and comparing that to the Septuagint. The question that I have regarding that is, do you think, like, what do you think about the differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint? Do you think there's a lot more differences than people realize, or do you really think that it's mostly the same? And I ask this
Um,
question because do you think the Septuagint, in a sense, is more the at least implying a little bit more polytheistic in the way it can be read than the Masoretic text, which is argued to be more monotheistic?
um, well, textual critics who study all the different families of Hebrew texts, they distinguish between the Masoretic text and the Proto-Septuagint text, and there's a few differences. I think they're fairly minor. Um, Sometimes the Septuagint preserves passages that have disappeared out of the Masoretic text, um, including in Genesis, 1 through 3. So you really have to compare all the different varieties you have to try and reconstruct what the original text looked like. But I would not say that the Septuagint was more polytheistic.
Okay.
You have polytheism throughout the whole Pentateuch. But in Genesis, um, in line with Plato's philosophy, all the gods running around on Earth, they were all good. You know, the uh,
Mm.
the gods in Genesis 1:26, they decide to make humans in their image, male and female. Um, the sons of God, they marry these beautiful women and have noble, gigantic offspring. Um, the Masoretic text, as well as the Septuagint, they don't portray that as negative in any way.
Mm.
Um, and actually, throughout the whole book of Genesis, nothing bad is said about any of the gods. They all have their different realms on Earth. They all get along. They all play nice, like
Yeah.
Plato uh, said. Plato said that the divine realm is completely good. And all the gods get along. There's no strife. He says specifically the gods are not jealous. There's no jealousy among the gods. And that continues throughout Genesis. When you get to Exodus to Joshua, it's a different story. Then you have monolatry, where ethics is redefined as worshiping one God only and attacking every other god. All the other gods are bad. All of the cults are evil. Um, all of the adherents of other gods within the land of Judea and Israel, the promised land, they're to be exterminated or enslaved. Um, so once you get into Exodus, then you have this strict monolatry where Yahweh is the only God to be worshipped. But that's not present in Genesis in either the Masoretic or Septuagint text. Um, it really shows that there were two different sets of authors at work, and Genesis is more philosophical, in line with Plato's philosophy, and the rest of the Pentateuch, um, the temple authorities and national leaders, they weren't going to have this thing where all the gods are okay. It was a change in tone. Um, but it doesn't have to do with MT versus LXX. It's two different sets of authors that work with different agendas, in my opinion. I discuss this a lot in my latest book.
Mm. So, final question. When you look at the five books that compose with that comprise the Torah,
Mhm.
um, so you say that they were written simultaneously, but in a somewhat similar scenario, you do think that they were compressing older Jewish oral traditions that, in that sense, is somewhat similar to the documentary hypothesis. Could you explain to the audience the advantages of concluding um, in that way that the documentary hypothesis does not have the advantage in?
Yeah, the documentary hypothesis detects a number of different voices in the Pentateuch, mostly in Genesis. There's the Yahwist who preferred to call the God, Yahweh. There's the Elohist or E, which preferred the term Elohim. The priestly source also used Elohim, but it did its own priestly thing. And the Deuteronomist was a separate deal. So the documentary hypothesis is very good in identifying characteristics of these three different sources, or four different sources. But one thing that the documentary hypothesis always had, which was just a naked assumption, is that these different authors, J, E, D, and P, that they all wrote it centuries apart, different versions. J was first, and then E came along. E didn't kick out J; he just added to J, and then the Deuteronomist came in, and then the priestly source. He didn't, even though he disagreed with the other sources, he didn't overwrite them. He just added on. So, so I really accept most of the arguments that there are all these different voices at work, but I see them as multiple authors that are contemporary. They're at Alexandria. There's, the legend said there were up to 70 of them. I don't think there were 70, but there were a few, and they all had competing agendas, but they all collaborated on the creation of this text.
Yeah.
And these different sources, they're intertwined. Sometimes J uses E and E uses J. J uses P and P uses J, so on and so forth, which drives the biblical critics crazy because none of them agree as to which came first because they're all using each other. So the advantage of my scenario is, or hypothesis, is that they were all contemporary.
Right.
Sometimes two of them would combine efforts on the same biblical passage, or sometimes they'd use one and then the other and back and forth, and really makes a lot more sense of the data, I think.
Can you tell us about what began your journey to eventually questioning when the Pentateuch was composed, and what led you to the conclusion that the Pentateuch was composed during the Hellenistic period?
Certainly. I was working on another book, In Search of the Pillars of Hercules, that was investigating the possible historical basis for certain Greek myths that Hercules had set up these inscriptions in various parts of the world during his travels. So one of the sources that mentions that is Berosus, who was a Babylonian priest who wrote around 278 BC. So I got a hold of his all the surviving fragments of his book in a collection found in the University of Oregon. Photocopied it all, read it, and I was struck how incredibly close Berosus read like early Genesis. It had a creation, it had 10 generations before the flood, it had the flood account, so on and so forth. And I was like, how is that possible? Because Berosus was not reading the Bible. So I just filed that under interesting because I didn't know what to do with that because Genesis was written, centuries earlier, according to most standard theories. Then I ran across the research of Niels Peter Lemke, who was a professor at the University of Copenhagen, and he said that the Pentateuch could have been written in the Hellenistic era. That the first evidence for it really was the Septuagint translation, and we don't know how much earlier than the Septuagint translation of around 270 BC the Pentateuch was actually written. So I thought, wow, that could explain the similarities with Berosus if Genesis was using Berosus instead of vice versa. So I did a systematic study of all the parallels between the cuneiform traditions, Genesis, Berosus, and I found that Genesis really resembles Berosus more than the earlier original cuneiform accounts that Berosus was largely reproducing. And so this led me to consider maybe the Pentateuch was written late. And then I started considering other Greek sources that resemble the Pentateuch, also in the Hellenistic era, that everyone has assumed copied from the Bible. Hecataeus of Abdera, Manetho with his stories of an exodus of the Hyksos to Jerusalem, and later figures and I kept on. Every time I would look at these Hellenistic era sources, all the evidence showed that they really were completely unaware of the biblical account, and that there's a definite relationship between the two in many cases, but it could only be explained by the Pentateuch borrowing from these Greek sources. So that ultimately led to my book, Berosus and Genesis, which I just wrote just out of sheer curiosity. And a friend of mine who was going to the University of Copenhagen at the time, Greg Doudna, he showed that to one of his professors, the famous Thomas L. Thompson, without my knowledge or asking him to. Thompson read it. He says, "We've got to publish this book." And so, boom, the book got published. And I've been really one of the foremost scholars on the subject of Greek sources in the Pentateuch and the Hebrew Bible since then.
I want to take a shift to the sources for a moment, like the external sources, like the Elephantine papyri and other texts like it. You note that in your book that none of these sources appear to cite any of the texts in the Pentateuch.
Yeah, that's true. The Elephantine papyri in particular is an extremely relevant example. They were written in the military colony of Elephantine, which is at the first cataract of the Nile. It's an island there. And there were Jewish military colonists there to protect the border of Egypt against invasion from Ethiopia. And there were, in this dry Egyptian climate, there's this treasure trove of documents that from about 450 to 400 BC that were discovered at Elephantine, written by these Jewish military colonists. And they corresponded with Jerusalem. They There's lots of legal deeds and this and that. There's not one reference in any of the Elephantine papyri um, about any religious writings. No Moses, no Abraham, no David. Um, they had their own temple at Elephantine in violation of the Deuteronomic code, and they were in communication with Jerusalem and Samaria. But evidently, it was not a problem. Um, they knew a 7-day week, but they didn't observe the Sabbath because they have business documents written on Saturdays, and they have one boat owner who threatened an employee, "You have to pick up these vegetables on Saturday, or else I'll have you killed. You pick those up." So, it was just business as usual uh, on Saturdays, and there's no evidence whatsoever that any biblical writings were in existence as late as 400 BC, basically on the eve of the Hellenistic era, which is, of course, after Alexander the Great conquered the East in, the 330s, 320s BC. So that's a huge scandal that there's no support for biblical literature or many biblical customs among the Jews at Elephantine as late as around 400 BC.
So, in other words, they weren't necessarily following the commandments given in the Pentateuch, which indicates to you that the Pentateuch didn't exist at the time because they weren't following that code yet.
They weren't, and there were communications from Judea about religious matters that did not cite or quote the Pentateuch. Um, there were many opportunities where they should have known about the Pentateuch if it was in existence, but um, there's no evidence of that. There's a book by Gard Granerod, excuse me, um, about the Elephantine colony and all the literature, and how this polytheistic, they worshiped multiple gods, including at the temple. Polytheistic Judaism was evidently the norm uh, at that time. The Elephantine were not some heterodox exception. This is just contemporary evidence of what uh, the religion of Yahweh looked like at that time. One of his professors said, "Yeah, that's really the elephant in the room, uh, because it flies in the face of all this long tradition of scholarship that assumes that these biblical books were written centuries earlier, and there's just no evidence, and the contemporary evidence points in exactly the opposite direction." Pentateuch's a late literature.
So, shifting back to the Septuagint, you state that the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible you believe were written around the same time. Do you think that the Septuagint is basically a Greek translation of that? Like they were, like in other words, were they translating it into Greek simultaneously?
Yeah, they wrote it in Hebrew. Clearly, the Pentateuch was written in Hebrew. It's a very wooden translation, literal, word for word, into the Greek. Um, so they wrote it in Hebrew, translated it practically immediately into Greek. Basically, two editions: one Hebrew edition, one Greek edition. Very similar to the Darius Law Code of about a century earlier in Egypt that had all the laws of Egypt that were published. and they were published both in Demotic, which was the local Egyptian language, and at the same time Aramaic, which was the universal language of the Persian Empire at that time. So the Egyptian laws came out in two languages simultaneously, and the same model seems to be true for the Hebrew Pentateuch.
Do you think that the Pentateuch is combining theology and stories that we see in Greek literature with Mesopotamian literature, like borrowing from Berosus and Plato and other similar sources like them and consolidating it into the Pentateuch?
Yeah, that's fairly accurate. Um, what I found in Berosus and Genesis were there were all these Greek sources, um, you know, running right up to like 273, 272 BC, which is virtually the same time as the Septuagint translation, which we know was from 273 to 269 BC. So I found you have the Greek sources that were found in the Great Library of Alexandria, and at virtually the same time, tradition says Jewish and Samaritan scholars were invited to Alexandria to create an edition of the Laws of Moses for the Great Library. So you have all these Jewish scholars in the Great Library of Alexandria, which was the center of learning of the whole world at that time. They had access to Berosus, Manetho, Plato, Hecataeus, Homer, Hesiod, the whole gamut of Greek literature. That's where they were working under royal patronage of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Um, and they were creating an edition of, the Pentateuch and the Laws of Moses for the Great Library. So the Great Library was the center of all of this. It's where the sources were. It's where I say it was written, and then it was where it was immediately translated as a prestige edition for the Great Library. Um, so I think it all happened with these bilingual Jewish and Samaritan scholars who knew Greek and Hebrew in Alexandria around 270 BC, 272, 273. And they put them all together, all these various sources. They consolidated them, yes.
When you look at the documentary hypothesis and the different sources that are discussed in Old Testament scholarship, like E, P, D, and J, do you think those sources could potentially be earlier, or do you think those sources and traditions emerged much later?
I consider those to be separate sources. Um, Basically, four voices that each contributed to the Pentateuch. But unlike the documentary hypothesis, there's really no evidence that J was in 900 BC and E 800 BC, and the Deuteronomist in 600 and something BC, the priestly source, and in the Persian era. I think they were all contemporary. Tradition said that it was a team of scholars at Alexandria, Jewish and Samaritan, and the tradition says it took 70 scholars to translate the books of Moses into Greek. Septuagint scholars say no, it was maybe two or three, because we can detect these different people doing the translating. So why were there so many scholars there? Well, the J Yahweh source these were probably Jewish scholars because a lot of their stories involved Judea. And the E source were probably Samaritan scholars because a lot of those take place a little bit further north. And the Deuteronomists and the priests, those were other groups. They were all collaborating on this together. They're all intertwined. They're basically contemporary. It was a team effort. Sometimes you have J using E. Sometimes you have E using J. Sometimes J uses B. Sometimes B uses J. So they were all working together, copying each other. Sometimes some stories, like the Joseph story, appears to have been co-written by J and E, the Yahwist and the Elohist, because they can separate those two parts of the Joseph story. But when you divide the novella into two parts like that, neither part make any sense. But they make a beautiful story when they're together. So, you had J authors and E authors together in the same room working on this as a team. Anyway, that's my model. It's like a documentary hypothesis, but it's a collaborative model. It's very similar, again, like the laws of Darius, codified in 500 and something BC, because they had priests, they had warriors, and they had scribes, three different teams that collected together those laws and put together the laws of Darius in 8 volumes. There's a lot of collaborative, collective authorship going on back in that day. So I have no problems with the distinct sources, but I just view them all as contemporary, basically in the same room together.
So basically what you're saying is, in the current conception of the documentary hypothesis, it's too hypothetical, and they're basically too arbitrarily dated without any strong evidence for them.
Yeah. I wrote an article in the documentary hypothesis be rehabilitated for Robert Price's journal, the Journal of Higher Criticism, and it goes through the evidence and shows lots of evidence that they were intertwined, contemporary, and not one century succeeding another after another. That's just hypothetical pie in the sky scholarship without any basis in evidence. So I meet the documentary hypothesis halfway. It does have some strong points in terms of identifying different voices, but the chronology is without any evidence at all.
So let's talk about how the authors of the Pentateuch formed characters such as Moses, for example. When you look at Moses to see how they formed the mythological background of this man, did they basically? I mean, what you say is they basically took Plato's laws, and they took stuff from Manetho and maybe Hecataeus, because I know you mentioned that Hecataeus, if I remember correctly, is the oldest reference to the Moses guy. And they coalesced the different versions of Moses and sprinkles of Plato, like salt, and just sprinkled it on Moses, basically.
Yeah, sure. That sounds fair enough. Yeah, the basic outline of the Exodus story was found in the writings of Hecataeus of Dara around 320 to 315 BC. He had a fictional foundation story, a typical Greek foundation story, in which an Egyptian named Moses set out from Egypt with a colonizing expedition to Judea, which was completely uninhabited at the time. And he established its capital, Jerusalem, built its temple, established its constitution and laws, and divided it into 12 tribes, like Plato recommended, and basically instituted all the ancient customs of the Jews. And this is one of many fictional foundation stories in Hecataeus. And obviously was not acquainted with the biblical account at all, because it contradicts it at virtually every point. But he wrote this in a book called the Egyptiaca, or the History of Egypt, that he wrote for the Ptolemies, and it was used to educate the young princes, including Ptolemy II Philadelphus. So they were all familiar with these traditions from Hecataeus, including this fictional foundation story, which was meant to aggrandize the Egyptians who colonized the world. They colonized Babylonia and Athens, and there's all sorts of fictional stories to that effect. So in the time of Ptolemy Philadelphus, they thought there was a figure named Moses, an Egyptian, who gave the Jews their ancient constitution and laws. And because the people who created the Great Library, they wanted it to have all the books in the world, and especially their legal section. They wanted all the laws in the world for reference. So they sent to the Jews and said, hey, we want a copy of those laws of Moses that we keep hearing about, that Hecataeus wrote about. And, the Jews and Samaritans said, sure, why not? We'll comply. We'll come to Alexandria, as you're inviting, and we'll put together a set of Mosaic laws. So Manetho had also, he had a couple kind of scandalous foundation stories of the Jews. They said that they were wicked Asiatics who had overthrown the Egyptians, and the Egyptians had to expel them back into Judea because they were such scoundrels. And so the Pentateuch also countered some of Manetho and kind of turned that on its head and said, we didn't destroy all the gods of Egypt. The Egyptians were attacking our God, and we didn't enslave the Egyptians, they enslaved us, so on and so forth. So there's some polemics in there too, but a lot of borrowing going on. And if you look at the legal codes of Moses, a lot of that comes out of Plato, out of Plato's laws and other Greek laws. So they were drawing on various sources and reacting to them in various ways, and borrowing what they could that fit in with this Ptolemaic mandate. And they came up with the story of Moses. Much like Plato recommended, he said, if you're going to have a set of laws, the best way to guarantee that they'll stay through time is you have to persuade everybody that they were ancient and divine and had never been changed. And then people superstitiously will stay very loyal to them throughout time. And that's pretty much what was done with the Pentateuch. They created an ancient foundation story. They gave their laws a divine origin, just like Plato said. And they followed his literary agenda. So you see multiple Greek sources and traditions in the Pentateuch, in my understanding of it.
And what is curious is you point out in the book that Hecataeus and Manetho, of course, strikingly never mentioned the Pentateuch when they discuss Moses.
That's true. And the Hecataeus, he said he consulted all sorts of Egyptian priests when he was writing his book. And Manetho, of course, was an Egyptian priest. He said that this one, well, the Egyptians had native stories how Asiatics would periodically invade Egypt, commit outrages against the gods, and then they'd have to be ejected. One such group was the Hyksos, the shepherd kings. And Manetho told this story about how they were ejected out of Egypt and founded Jerusalem and its temple a long, long time ago. And then a later one was this Egyptian priest of the god of chaos, Seth Typhon. His name was Osir-Seth, and he led this band of lepers in alliance with the Hyksos. They ravaged Egypt, and they were expelled into Judea too. And Manetho adds, and some people say Osir-Seth is the same as Moses, where he's referring to Moses from Hecataeus, not Moses from the Jewish Bible, because none of his stories resemble the biblical Exodus at all. I mean, they're local, authentic Egyptian stories. But he said that some people in his day were slanderously saying that this leper priest, Osir-Seth, was the same as the guy Moses that Hecataeus was writing about. So you have, that's the second mention of Moses in ancient literature. But he didn't know anything about Jewish writings either, and his writings betray nothing from the Pentateuch. But the Pentateuch reacts against him quite energetically. So the Pentateuch has to be younger than Hecataeus. It has to be younger than Manetho and Berosus, and that gets you right close down to the time of the Septuagint translation.
But the more striking thing, of course, is that Manetho, who is writing significantly later than Hecataeus, still did not mention the Pentateuch, and he knew more about the Jewish people than presumably Hecataeus ever did. Let's shift to discussing the fall of man and Adam. Do you see Adam in the book of Genesis as a synthesis of the fall of man under the Prometheus scenario, perhaps, and with a mix of the Adapa myth and other Mesopotamian myths?
Well, Adam was created out of the earth, much like Prometheus created humans out of clay and water. There were several Greek myths that talked about humans in various countries being fashioned out of the earth by the gods in those different regions. So there's definitely some echoes of the Greek myths there. Prometheus too, he revealed all the arts of civilization to humanity: fire, shipbuilding, how to build houses and clothing. And because man, in the Prometheus story and in most Greek myths, the original humans were naked and defenseless, and they needed technology to survive. They needed civilization right from the outset, and that sort of knowledge was only provided by the gods. They possessed that sort of knowledge. You have something similar in the Mesopotamian myths, where there were some creatures called the Akalu, who were half fish and half human. They were semi-divine creatures, and they were so wise. There were 7 of them, and they visited the earliest humans that were created by Marduk, and you know, and they came and they taught humans arts of civilization. So, and there's everyone's compared those to the Prometheus myth. It's very similar to Greek traditions and the Mesopotamians in that regard. Um, so what you really have is a contrast between this Eden with Adam and Eve living in a paradise, not having to work for a living, just eating the fruit off of all the trees. Very similar to the first age of Kronos in Greek myth. And then after the age of Kronos, you had the age of Zeus, where in the age of Kronos, the ground just produced fruits automatically. Humans could talk to animals. They didn't need clothes. Everything was wonderful. And then in the age of Zeus, all that was taken away. They had to learn agriculture, technology. And Prometheus showed them those arts. Zeus got very mad at him for that. And in the Mesopotamian myths, Kalu showed humans the arts of civilization. So it mixes in from both worlds. The authors of early Genesis, some of them were probably Babylonian Samaritans, who had a strong background in Babylonian traditions. So that's why they drew on Berosus and the Mesopotamian flood tradition and a lot of Babylonian material in early Genesis, as well as Greek. So they had one foot in each world because they were very educated, well read in world literature. And they also had a preference for Babylonian traditions due to their ethnic background. The Book of Kings talks about how when Samaria fell and the northern kingdom came to an end, that there was a colony of Babylonians that were brought to Samaria. And, they continued down to the Hellenistic era. You can trace some of their literary and intellectual activities. And so you see a lot of Babylonian and Assyrian influences in the Jewish Bible and the Pentateuch.
If you could you provide what you would say is one of the best examples of the Pentateuch combining material from Hellenistic literature with Mesopotamian literature? And the reason I ask is because some people might say, well, when they comb through the Pentateuch, they only see Mesopotamian parallels, but they are having a difficult time finding a Hellenistic parallel.
Sure. Everyone agrees that the main plot line of the flood in Genesis 9 through 10, whatever, 6 through 9, say, it's Mesopotamia. It comes from the Epic of Atrahasis that was found in, I think, Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it's a Mesopotamian flood story. They had an ark. They had people getting aboard the ark with animals. They had the birds being released. All of that very clearly Mesopotamian. But the lead up to the flood, though, was very different. In Mesopotamian literature, the gods got annoyed because of all these noisy humans. The gods couldn't get to sleep, so they said, let's wipe them out. They're disturbing our rest. And that was the reason why the gods sent the flood. In the biblical account, um, it's an ethical degeneration. You have the sons of God intermarrying with beautiful humans. They create this race of Nephilim or warriors, giants, men of renown. And but then through time, they become corrupt. Everything becomes violent and wicked, and so the flood is sent as punishment on the humans. Well, that's Greek, and specifically, that's Plato's Critias, which was the story of Atlantis. In the story of Atlantis, Poseidon was the god who ruled Atlantis. He married a beautiful human girl, had 10 offspring, the kings of Atlantis. The first was Atlas, who, was a giant. And they were wonderful for a long time, but over time, they became corrupt. Every generation, these semi-divine rulers would marry human women. And so the human part got stronger and the divine part became weakened until eventually they were just like normal human kings who were violent and lawless and ambitious. And Zeus said, enough is enough. And I'm going to send earthquakes, rain, and flood and destroy this continent of Atlantis that was so wicked and lawless that they sent fleets of ships to invade the Mediterranean and take over and enslave the whole world. Plato's story of Atlantis said the Athenians fought them off heroically and, stood to the bitter end. And then this earthquake and flood wiped them out. So other than, that is the only other ancient story that has a moral cause for this world flood. The next time you see it is in Ovid Metamorphosis, which is like 1st century BC. But back in the time when Genesis was written, the 270s, Plato, he was the only other one who turned it into this ethical drama where the flood was to purge humans of wickedness and to give humanity a new fresh start. So here you have Mesopotamian elements, the flood story, with Noah and the ark. And it's combined with this whole Greek Atlantis story with gods marrying beautiful women and having gigantic offspring, and then the world degenerating, and that's why there was a flood. So there's a good example of the Greeks and the Babylonian myths being combined. I think that's one of the best ones, and I talk about this a lot in my latest book, Plato's Timaeus and the Biblical Creation Account.
Right. We discussed that in our first interview.
Yeah.
So what do you think the motivation was to put together the Hebrew Pentateuch? Was it for the same reasons the Septuagint was put together, or for a different?
Well, it was basically the same project. The project was initiated by agents from Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who had heard about Moses and his laws in ancient times, how Moses wrote the Jewish constitution and laws, and he wanted a copy for the Great Library. So he sent the request. the Jews, in collaboration with Samaritans who were probably a little more literate and educated, they went to Alexandria and they complied. And they left the copy in Greek for the Great Library because that's what Ptolemy wanted. They also got a copy of the Hebrew too, but the Greek was that was really meant for public distribution to the civilized world, whereas the Hebrew edition they brought back with them, and that became the new national laws and law code and way of life of the Jews, who basically reinvented their national way of life around 270 BC. Up to that time, they'd just been a normal government with a governor, and then over to one side you had the high priest and the temple. But starting in 270 BC, they had a theocracy, a reinvented form of government that was a new type of government that Plato advocated in Plato's laws, where the nation would be ruled with divine ancient laws and by a ruling council of high priests and theologians and experts of the law. So, so the Pentateuch was meant to be an authoritative set of new laws to govern the new reinvented Jewish nation as of about 270 BC. So there was a domestic market, and then there was an international market. It was on two tracks.
Well, I think we can end there. So thanks for joining me once again, Russell.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.